Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Lydia Ramsey Pflanzer. I'm a deputy editor over at Endpoints News. I had the opportunity to cover this report this morning, so I'm really excited to be a part of the chat. Title of this webinar is Unpacking the Blue Ocean Opportunities in Women's Health. Thanks again for joining. We'll be here for about an hour, so really excited to get into it. I think we can go to the next slide. Great. Just to start us off, we've got some housekeeping material. Except with the exception of the panelists, all lines are on mute, just for background noise perspectives. We'd love to be in conversation with you guys as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. So I'll be keeping my eye out on the Q&A feature, so feel free to send in questions in the moment, toward the end of the conversation. I'll be planning to incorporate them as best I can in a conversation to come, and especially at the end. If you'd like to turn off closed captioning, you can do so by clicking the live transcript button on the Zoom bar below. And we'll be sending a link to the recording from this conversation after today's webinar. And we're hoping to be sending out a link to the full report during the course of this call. Or here it is now. Perfect. Great, we can go to the next slide. Awesome. So our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. I'm giving the welcome remarks, and then I'll be turning it over to Raysa Bousleiman, who will be giving us the report overview. We'll be turning to a panel discussion after that, followed by Q&A. To the next slide, please. Great. And yeah, I just wanted to give you a sense of the speakers you'll be hearing from today. In addition to me, like I mentioned, Raysa is the Vice President of Life Sciences and Healthcare at Silicon Valley Bank, and she's one of the authors on this report. We're joined as well by Baburek, the co-founder and CEO of Hera Biotech, as well as Naseem Sayani, co-founder and managing director of Emmeline Ventures. Awesome. Raysa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lydia. So I'm so excited to be finally unveiling this report. It's our first ever report that is fully devoted to women's health. And I'm just one of the 9 researchers that worked on it. So I want to give them a shout out. We interviewed countless founders, investors, scientists, thought leaders in the space. And I'm really, really excited with what we've put together. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I wanted to kick off first by explaining how we at SVB are defining women's health. So when it comes to women's health, there is at times some confusion or competing definitions on what women's health encompasses. Ida Tin, the founder of Clue, which was one of the first major period tracking apps, termed the coin femtech in 2016, and it really catapulted the industry into the spotlight. But the name femtech limits the sector to just digital technology. So instead, we're considering the life sciences, including biopharma, diagnostics and tools, and medical devices, as well as health tech or digital health that address underserved care needs for women and individuals with female biologies. They address conditions that are women-specific, also conditions that affect women differently or disproportionately. They also address concerns that are characterized by gender-based discrepancies in care. So we've all heard the very real stats around women's pain and how it's not taken as seriously. And unfortunately, there are similar implications in behavioral health as well. Finally, they may also address racial disparities and inequities in women's health, So for example, conditions that impact women of color differently, or companies that aim to provide culturally competent care while fighting the systemic racism that impacts people of color's health and well-being. A good example of that is Health InterHue for Black mothers. They provide culturally competent care to Black mothers who are expecting. Next slide, please. So we uncovered 4 main takeaways and predictions in the report. The first was growth in non-reproduction focus areas. So women's health it's had a long prevailing misconception that women's health is limited just to a woman's reproductive years, so fertility and pregnancy. investors are now warming up to the untapped opportunity to serve the vast spectrum of women's health needs beyond reproduction and across their full life courses. And I'll dig into that a little bit later. The next is addressing unmet needs with life sciences. So women's health solutions have leaned largely towards health tech or digital health, and life sciences are actually underrepresented in women's health. So life sciences comprise 66% of all healthcare deals overall, but in women's health, it's only 46%. And we all know that not everything can be solved with an app. So the problem is the life sciences face even more of an uphill battle when it comes to equality. This largely stems the lack of female representation in clinical trials. Women were excluded from them up until 1993. So if you think about R&D and how long those timelines can be, you'll realize is relatively recent. And now that they are included, they are often underrepresented, especially for diseases that disproportionately impact women. For example, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of women in the US, but women actually represent only 1 in 3 clinical trial participants. So there's still no requirements to report separate trial findings on the basis of sex. Even women's health research is underfunded when compared to spending on conditions that affect men of the same burden. So if you have 2 diseases, they impact people at the same rate. Ones that primarily impact men receive more funding than ones that primarily impact women. And even the way that we measure disease burden doesn't fully encompass women's health needs. This is something I was really surprised to learn while I was researching this report, but when they measure disease burden, for example, it does weigh for pelvic pain, but it doesn't weigh for vaginal bleeding outside of menstruation. Even though vaginal bleeding is certainly something that can be uncomfortable, painful, and even life-altering for some women. So the systemic lack of female representation across all stages of the research process has resulted in real gaps in our medical knowledge and major data gaps. So this is the main challenge that the life sciences face in this sector, but in the future, as clinical trials move forward and more data becomes available, we're hoping that clinical development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and devices will progress. Next is the rise of dedicated women's health funds. So the massive market opportunity for women's health is too big to ignore. Women represent half the population, and in the US make 80% of healthcare decisions. So despite that, the cohort of investors is relatively small. So we expect investment firms to devote more resources and develop expertise in this undervalued segment, both from emerging managers choosing to specialize and general investors adding women's health into their investment theses. And finally, the tilt toward later stage. So as an emerging space, women's health investment has skewed more towards the early stages. About 50% of investment in women's health goes into early stage deals compared to 40% for the broader healthcare sector. So while we don't expect those early stage deals to slow, we do believe that with time, later stage deals will take a larger share of investment as the sector matures and more companies demonstrate value. Next slide, please. So, okay, digging into the data. So here we took a look at healthcare, VC, and growth funds that have closed funds since 2017. And we generally found that fund managers investing in women's health tend to fall into 3 buckets. So the first is general investors who invest across tech and life science healthcare that have started investing in women's health. The next are healthcare VC firms that have a women's health dedicated focus area. And then the final are firms that are exclusively focused on women's health. And for founders, the difference in these types of investors tends to show up at different stages in the fundraising process. So the specialized investors have really deep domain and sector knowledge to understand the technical complexities. However, they may often command smaller funds and therefore write smaller checks. They tend to get involved at the earlier stages. For capital-intensive companies like biopharma, for example, or later stage companies, this can be limiting. And that brings us to general investors who generally write larger checks, have larger funds, and tend to get involved at the later stages as well. But their limited sector knowledge is a considerable and often insurmountable hurdle. We found that there may be a sweet spot for founders, which is general funds that have a dedicated women's health focus area. And we've seen some really impressive activity by these types of firms this year and believe it'll lead to more investor interest in the space. For example, Google Ventures led the $25 million Series A round for Midi Health this year, which is a perimenopause and menopause, focused company. And Lux Capital also has a women's health dedicated investment thesis, and they raised the largest health fund in 2023 at a staggering $1.2 billion. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at investment. And so as with most VC sectors, women's health has seen a drop in deal activity this year compared to the last. However, it is worth noting that investment dollars are actually up 8% relative to the first 3 quarters of 2022. So compared to the screeching slowdown that we're seeing in the broader innovation economy, women's health has actually fared quite well and may be seeing more of a speed bump. And I'd like to point your attention to the top right chart, which is looking at percent change in investment since 2018. When you look at healthcare overall, it's up 28%. And women's health is up a staggering 314%. So investment's been building for years, and it is, like I said, fared well despite the slowdown in the broader economy. So really, really promising investment numbers. This increase in investment and demand, along with rising inflation, resulted in increased seed stage valuations for women's health companies in recent years. And you'll see that on the bottom left chart. However, one thing we were surprised to find was that across all stages and sectors, women's health companies are consistently valued lower than healthcare companies overall. One reason for that could be that female-founded companies tend to be undervalued. 76% of women's health companies have a female founder, which is 3 times higher than the the overall innovation ecosystem. So this bias underscores the challenges that female-founded companies face in the male-dominated VC landscape. And this is despite the findings that female founders generate twice as revenue per funding dollar than men. Another reason for the lower valuations could be the lack of data collection on women's health conditions. This is a roadblock when it comes to convincing investors there's a need, accurately estimating market size, receiving FDA approval, and getting reimbursed in uncharted waters. However, there are promising signs of a changing tide, most clearly demonstrated by the recent White House initiative on women's health research, which does aim to close research gaps in the space. Next slide, please. So here we've displayed women's life stages across the top, which is broken out into adolescent and young adults, middle years, and later years. And then we have tied investment numbers to conditions that most often come up during these different stages of life. And really one of the key takeaways that we've pulled out is, like I mentioned earlier, that women's health is really expanding beyond reproduction. And we're certainly seeing that play out. Investment into non-reproductive focused startups reached $435 million in Q3 2023, which is the largest quarter on record. And we expect this trend to accelerate as we see early adopters start to tout the benefits and importance of improved care for menopause, pelvic floor health, endometriosis, and other issues that really impact women's health and well-being outside of reproduction. We've also seen some really big fertility and pregnancy players expand their platforms into other areas. So, for example, Kindbody and Maven recently expanded their platforms into menopause and mental health care over the past year. And investment into menopause increased 2x between 2021 and 2022. So there's clearly a huge white space opportunity to fill gaps in women's healthcare outside of the fertility and pregnancy spaces. Next slide, please. So this is the final report slide before we dive into the panel discussion, which I'm very excited for. And this covers exits. So this is VC-backed M&A, IPOs, including de-SPACs in the women's health space. So as the VC downturn persists and the women's health space matures, there's been a stacking up of women's health companies that are ready to exit. However, with the broader downturn affecting the innovation economy overall, we have seen exit opportunities remain limited, and depressed valuations are really keeping the IPO window latched shut. It's worth noting that among the 5 VC-backed women's health companies that went public since 2018, all have lost at least 50% of their peak value. Sera Prognostics, the highest valued of this cohort, saw 74% of its market cap evaporate since January 2022. So the struggle of these recently IPO'd companies, it's not unique to the space. We've seen this across all of healthcare, life sciences, not to mention tech. But it is having a knockoff effect on valuations earlier in the VC lifecycle. Moving to M&A though, activity has really picked up. So M&A buyers are seizing the opportunity to acquire customers and products at a discount. None of the 5 women's health acquisitions this year had disclosed details, which is a sign that often means the terms may have favored the buyer. But still, it's worth noting that 15 women's health companies were acquired in the past 2 years, which is more deals than the prior 5 years combined. So in some cases, other VC-backed companies are doing the buying. So for example, in March, Maven, the women's health clinic, acquired Natal, which is a London-based digital clinic. And this undisclosed deal is an example of really the kind of strategy that these late-stage women's health companies are deploying to grow. And we expect consolidation to continue as companies struggle with valuations and may seek partners in an effort to control really their own destinies. We also may see more consolidation as point solution fatigue may contribute. See this a lot in health tech and digital health, where you have a lot of these point solutions that are focused on, one thing. And for employers that are looking to have these resources available to their employees, it can often be overwhelming. There might be pressure for them to communicate with each other. So like I mentioned, Maven, Kindbody expanding their platforms into other areas, may be an example of that. And finally, the bottom right chart, top women's health startups by valuation. I just wanted to call out that Maven, last valued at 1.35 billion, is one of the 6 women's health companies valued at over 500 million, and it may be looking to exit in the not so distant future. And that brings me to the end of the report recap. So Lydia, I can turn it to you so we can kick off the panel discussion.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Raysa. That was super informative. And now I've got my little IPO goggles on as a reporter. But awesome. Really excited to get into this. I figured one of the best places to start might be Naseem and Summer. I'd love to get your reactions to the report. Summer, maybe let's start with you. What stood out to you the most of some of the information presented in the report?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here. So one of the things that I found in the report to be really helpful was the nuggets of positivity. So looking at, the number or the growth of investment in women's health versus the overall. So you're seeing that it's holding strong. And while the end game, so to speak, some of the exits aren't exactly what we would hope to see at this point, you have to have the pipeline before you get what you want to see on the exit side. So I think there's a lot of positivity to be gleaned from the report. And as the CEO of a women's health company, I need that in my life. So I was glad to see it.
Naseem, how about you?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me as well. The report is it's so interesting, and there are, of course, complexities to it. I mean, what market is not complex right now? So it's consistent with how other categories are performing. So really 2 good things. One is that we're seeing investment across the full life cycle of a woman's lived experience and not just over-rotated in fertility. And that's promising because as a fund that's investing also across the life cycle of a woman's lived experience, it's good to see the whole market doing that also, because we go well beyond our fertility as humans, as women. And the second thing is that seeing the more diverse led graduation into Series A rounds is also good. And what I mean by that is there's a little bit of a conundrum with women's health companies where they get funded by really passionate female VCs up front and often have trouble getting to the Series A round because the demographics of the Series A check writers just currently doesn't include enough women. So there's not a lived experience understanding. But with Google Ventures leading the round for MIDI, with Left Lane Capital leading the round for EBI, these are not predominantly female-led funds. They're actually fairly diverse in terms of leadership. And that's a really great indicator for the category also, because it means we know we're not niche, but like actually not niche. And we're seeing capital coming from those who are historically considered the big investors have caught on, right? And they're looking at the category and they're writing checks into it. So that's a really great thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I can't wait to dive into that a little bit more in our discussion. Raysa, I know you just gave us a whole 15-minute presentation, but I wanted to give you the chance. It's how my journalism brain works. What if there was like one thing you wanted folks to take away from reading this report, what would it be? Like I used to call it like the tweet-sized bite, but maybe Twitter's not so relevant anymore.
I love that question. I think one of the main things as I was putting together the report was really noticing the difference in life sciences versus health tech or digital health and like the unique challenges they face based on their different business models. I was really surprised. I mean, I knew it was underfunded as a sector, but I didn't know candidly as much on the research side, the gaps in data collection and clinical trial inclusion.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of my key takeaways. I know it's not maybe the most positive one, but just like the stark amount of bias and inequity when it comes to really the science. But I will say it was promising. I mean, we've seen the recent White House initiative, which is pretty well timed with this report, I will say. So I think there are promising signs of a changing tide. But that was really one thing that surprised me and I can't stop telling my friends about when I was researching the report.
Definitely. Yeah. Got a mix of reactions to this. I love it. Yeah. And I wanted to get into, one of them in particular. I think this was super interesting to see just how still high women's health funding is compared to 5 years ago. That ended up being my headline for today's story that I wrote on the topic. It's so much higher than 28% or so in healthcare overall. That's the increase over 2018. And I just kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit further because it does seem to be bucking the trend a bit. And Naseem, you mentioned a lot of this as well, but Raysa, just from doing the research for this report, what's from your perspective, why women's health funding is staying at a higher rate than say healthcare overall?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'm curious to hear Summer and Naseem's takes, but my take is that when I was researching women's health, it really reminded me of a mental health report that I did a couple of years ago that was looking at mental health investments over time and trends and investor interest. And I think with mental health, what you saw was, a lot of stigmatization, a lot of misunderstanding, potentially understudied. And even on the employer side, like I feel like back when I first started working, there was not this huge expectation of your employer to provide really great mental health resources. And I have to say, I feel like that's really changed. So women's health reminds me a little bit of that. I mean, I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but it is reminding me of that in the sense that women's health and their concerns, it's getting more talked about. There's certainly still really strong stigmas that we need to address, but starting to see the tides changing a little bit. Menopause, for example, I feel like was never talked about, or it was reduced to just hot flashes. But as you have a ton of women in the workforce and an aging population, it's all the more relevant, especially for employers, to make sure that that group of their employees is healthy and feels like their needs are met. So I think it's a combination of stigma going down and people just addressing and acknowledging that women's health needs have been severely underserved. And to that point, like I had in the research of this report, I had a conversation with a founder who mentioned that women's health is kind of plagued by this weird notion that we've accepted just okay outcomes, or, you know, we've accepted that painful bleeding is okay or acceptable. So hopefully you'll start to see some of those misconceptions or, you know, ways, schools of thought start to really get broken apart.
Yeah, gotcha. That's super fascinating. Summer, from where you sit, how have you kind of experienced this increase in funding for your
Yeah.
founder?
So, yeah. So, you know, with us, we're specifically an endometriosis diagnostic. And so I can recall when we first started pitching for our seed round back in, you know, 2021, 2020, we had to spend the first 15 minutes to 20 minutes of every pitch explaining what endometriosis was and how, like, convincing people that it was actually a problem. And I will say in recent days, when we say the word endometriosis, you get the head nods, you know, from the people in the room because it's become a familiar topic, or it's at least a word that they've heard. So I think, you know, Raysa hit the nail on the head. There's this kind of destigmatization. And as my dear friend Naseem says all the time, use all the words all the time. So I think women are speaking more openly about their health. And I think that that's making it a less taboo topic. And it's also bringing awareness to some of these groups. I think another reason that you see steady funding in women's health, and it's a bit more of a cynical view, but I do think that there's some play there, is female founders don't pad the coffers. So we're not sitting on over invested rounds that, you know, leave our bank accounts such that we can sit back when the market isn't favorable for us and not go out and raise the round or do the work, because we don't have that luxury. So I think that even in depressed markets, there's probably a higher percentage of female founders, specifically those in women's health fields, out there raising the money, and it keeps that trajectory more level than some of the other sectors where the founders have the luxury of saying, ooh, market, you know, conditions right now aren't exactly favorable for founders raising rounds. We've got enough in the bank. We're going to hold off and wait before we raise again. And so I think that's another perhaps more cynical viewpoint, but I do think that it is playing a role.
Yeah, that's really an interesting observation. Naseem, how have you seen that kind of change the game? You mentioned about, you know, Series A adoption. One of the things I saw in the report was, you know, just the rise of generalist investors popping up into the space. Raysa mentioned GV, other folks. How are you feeling about that environment? Is it feeling different than it used to?
Well, it's I think there's a couple things. So one, I'm hoping more of the market is realizing that women's health isn't niche anymore, or actually never was, and it's just we're understanding what that means. And I know that our fund, along with others in our peer group, we're starting to talk about women's health slightly differently, because there's actively separating the empathy of the experience from the numbers of the experience ends up being what is changing minds. I won't say hearts, because we have to change the minds around this. And so when we start to talk about women's health as being 50% of the population that's birthing 100% of the future, that's going to be in menopause for 40 to 50% of her life, who's going to purchase a subscription product every month for the 40 to 50% of her life, you start to talk about a market opportunity that's significant. And so the TAMs on women's health are in the trillions. And I'm a little bit of a data junkie, which you'll all appreciate, but in 2022, the women's health as a category was over $1 trillion in value. All of VC deployed $455 billion across every sector that VC deploys capital into. Less than 2% of that went to women's health. So there's $1 trillion opportunity. It's bigger than VC as a category also. And I think people are finally understanding that this is the arbitrage opportunity that we've been looking for. And the behaviors, the trends, the demand are all showing up in the doctor's offices. They're showing up at employers. They're showing up in how we're interacting online. They're showing up in search strings on Google. So we're finally seeing now we're past the tipping point of critical mass of what consumers are looking for and what businesses are looking for. And that's now what's shifting the importance. Because I'll tell you, we've said it's a big opportunity for 5 years. But now everyone's like, oh, it's a big opportunity. I'm like, well, yes, thank you, welcome. And so I think that just the momentum behind how much more we understand about the numbers behind what this category is are becoming much more talked about.
Gotcha. Yeah, you hear so much about folks being so bullish on areas like AI, but that can disconnect of we got changing heart or minds, not hearts. That
Yeah.
seems like an important distinction to be building. One of the questions that came through the Q&A, and thank you everyone for submitting Q&A questions. I'm keeping my eye out on them, hoping to bring them into the conversation. Was just about building sustainable health tech companies. And I kind of wanted to, Naseem, ask you a little bit more about that in the context of this funding environment, seeing more generalists. Are there particular benchmarks or things that startups should be looking for to make sure that their business can get that kind of more generalist impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. This will sound obvious, but differentiation will always be a big deal. A little bit, and Raysa, you spoke to some of the consolidation that we know is going to happen in women's health. I think thinking about what the implication of that is for the business that you're building, because there's a lot of really great point solutions out in the market right now, but we will start to see consolidation, and you want to think about how you position yourself to be the consolidator, not the consolidatee. And so, is there background noise? Are we okay? Okay, good. Okay. And so I think that's something that founders have to think about more deliberately, is what it's going to take to make sure you're the tip of the spear. Data has to be part of whatever you build. How you're closing the gap on basic science is going to start to be critical in how you build a business in women's health. The intersection we haven't seen enough about yet for appropriate reasons is women's health and AI. And that's because we don't have enough basic science. So that has to be part of how founders are thinking about positioning, because that will prove longevity. It'll create sustainability. It will mean that you can be in business for some time versus being a one-shot solution that then doesn't have a place to go as the category grows up.
Great, that's super helpful. Yeah, and I'm getting a few questions in the chat around, regulatory environments and kind of vetting and science and things like that, which makes me want to dive a little bit deeper into, Raysa, one of the things you brought up around funding for some of the hard sciences, as you called it. And I know Summer, if I'm guessing right, that's an area you play in quite well. So I kind of wanted to put that question to you. How have you encountered this lagging of investments with your company, with Hera?
Sure, absolutely. So I think that these are my opinions. So I'll just preface it with that. So I think that when femtech and women's health kind of first started as a category that came onto some people's radar, quite obviously, we went for the low-hanging fruit, which was women had been left out of the healthcare conversation. They had been left out of the conversation of what sort of solutions they wanted to see and the best ways to address health concerns, wellness concerns that they had. So you saw a big influx of companies that were addressing those solutions or those pain points directly with women who had been left out of that conversation. Now, I think that you're seeing a rise of companies who are saying, okay, it's not enough that women are consumers of healthcare, because at the end of the day, I have a very dear friend who loves to say, Melissa Boley is her name. She says, you can't give birth in the metaverse. Like you can't. So at some point, we have to engage the hard sciences. We have to engage the clinic. We have to engage the practitioners in this space, who I, quite frankly, think have been left out of the conversation too and ignored from industry. And they've been doing the best with the solutions that they had, which are insufficient at this point. And so I think that it's really important that we focus on these areas and we don't ignore the fact that women are more than consumers of healthcare. We do have to provide solutions that follow a more traditional regulatory and path to market in terms of life sciences. And I think there was a question in the Q&A that came through that was talking about whether this is really niche or is it a regulatory barrier or other hurdles that come in. And it's all of the above, right? So the same thing that I was talking about in the beginning of talking about endometriosis and is it a problem and explaining all of that. investors who traditionally invest in diagnostics or med devices or, especially anything that has to do with AI are accustomed to companies having these huge databases of information that they can build kind of a tweaked algorithm from published, computational models, tweak it and train it on these massive databases, and then come forward with these huge amounts of information that help push investors over the edge. Women don't have that. Naseem made the point, we've been left out of the basic science. So, our company specifically is looking at live cell expression data in the endometrium. I think we have the largest biorepository of that in the US for sure. So startups probably shouldn't have the largest biorepository of information when you're talking about 51% of the population. So I think that it's really important that, as investors look through this, they also look past just the health tech portion of it, which Raysa pointed out in the beginning. They wanted to look at these different things. And while they are more traditional paths to market, because of that, I think if investors will reframe that in their mind as these are moats that will also help their position in the market, their defendability, because others that follow them will have to go through that same regulatory pathway. And so I do think that there are hurdles in place, when you talk about that, the FDA is like, oh, yes, a diagnostic, of course. Yes, we just need, 2,500 patients. And it's like, oh, you're cute. We don't have that because we're not diagnosing this. So, that's a difficulty that we have to overcome. But I think that you're seeing headway. The FDA has made a bunch of statements that are positive, I think, in my mind. They want to work with women's health companies. They recognize that it's been an underserved area. And I think that they mean that. And so I think that there'll be a kind of a critical mass that you saw first in the femtech space and the health tech space. I think you're starting to see the first parts of that in the hard sciences piece of it. And that gives me a lot of hope for companies like ours. But more importantly, I'm the mother of 3 daughters. I want all the things in the hard sciences to get to the market because I want to make sure that whatever solution they need, it's there for them and the practitioners have the availability to use it.
For sure. Naseem, how have you encountered this as an investor? I guess I think one of the questions I'm seeing bubbling up is, what does regulation and just kind of the existing framework stand in the way of building really successful businesses and building, something that investors can continue to back? Have you kind of had to grapple with that as well?
So yes and yes. There's 2 big things we think about. One is, the women's health category could, if it wanted to, build an entire second layer system of care that sits outside of the existing healthcare. I call it a healthcare tower. There's a healthcare tower, and there's a lot of really great startups building new towers around that core healthcare tower. That could persist. The problem is that there's a lot of funding sitting in the tower. And so we have to back into what the CPT codes are, what's getting paid for by insurance. And so we can't build a healthcare system outside of the current healthcare system. These things have to be integrated. And so what we talk to a lot of our founders in our portfolio about is that how are they thinking about, even if they launch B2C, how do they then grow a B2B relationship footprint integration? Because what you really want to have happen is to bring those new opportunities for care, those new care protocols into the primary system. And there has to be a level of influence. There has to be a way to teach new tricks to a healthcare tower that's been doing the same thing for a good number of years. And so we will talk a lot with our founders about how they're building both of those channels and how they're thinking about the payer and provider relationships they're going to need in order to scale their business. Because ultimately, we are going to need, thank you, we are going to need healthcare. They're going to need our healthcare payers to support the healthcare services that we're providing to women's health that may not be in the billing system right now. And we need it to show up in the billing system. And so I like to say we value what we pay for, and we need to start valuing the things that matter to women's health in the same way that we value other procedures and outcomes right now. So that's one thing that we have to have our teams think about and our portfolios think about. The other one is that, I saw a question in here also about the number of the gynecologists out there that are in the market and able to be a conduit to bringing more women's health to the women they work with. And it's absolutely right. But there's also a pretty big divide between more progressive kind of front end thinkers when it comes to gynecology and the lack of basic science and an awareness of what they did or did not learn in medical school. And then there's a whole base of people who have done things the same way for a number of years and need a lot more evidence in order to change how they're going to deliver care. And those conversations look different. And we just need more education, more talking. Even a little bit of evidence of a better care protocol should be enough to deliver a new standard of service. And so how are companies thinking about thought leadership and education and what they're telling the market on the outcomes of what they're doing to then start to create a conversation that goes well beyond the one-on-ones they might be having. So it's a big part of storytelling, and the other big part is really thinking about the B2B relationships that are going to ultimately support what you're building, even if it starts B2C.
Totally. Yeah. And I think this brings up a question in my mind, and any of the three of you feel free to jump in and answer it. Like who is then responsible for making that happen? Is it the onus on, a startup like Hera, or is it on, the US government? Or is it on, payers to start recognizing this? How does that conversation start to change, or has it started to change, since it feels like it's already on its way?
Yeah, I think I can piggyback kind of on what Naseem was just talking about. When you talk about these traditional payer systems or the traditional healthcare system, and there are protocols and mechanisms that are well established and paths that are well worn there. So I think that the responsibility is, I think it falls squarely on everyone for different aspects of it. I think for the provider, it needs for them to be willing to shift their perspective on how their patient would like to be treated. And they should be incentivized and rewarded for doing so, because that improves outcomes, which, by the way, then makes things less expensive for payers. So I think if we can shift the way that we look at the incentives that we have in the established system, it will actually provide better opportunities for all of the stakeholders involved. It will provide physicians the ability to provide the type of care they would like to provide to their patients. I fully believe that. It would also provide the payers in the space to see that improved outcomes, preventative care, incorporating some of these things that add value to the quality of life of a patient actually improves their bottom line. And then the responsibility on startups like Hera is to do some of the early legwork to show the data that when you incorporate these interventions earlier, or you incorporate them and give the patient peace of mind or the ability to understand, yes, I understand that there is no drugs approved to treat endometriosis. It doesn't mean that I don't need to know that I have something called endometriosis. Diagnosis is important. It does give us a peace of mind. It does increase our quality of life. And how does that translate to the bottom line all the way down the pathway? And so I do think the responsibility is shared between all parties. And I think that we need to focus on different aspects that each of us can control and contribute to, so that the overall system improves.
I think I'll add to that just on the roles to play. I do think venture has a really big role to play in telling stories and providing the leading indicators on where the world is headed and what kinds of things the future consumers will want. And it's the role venture has played for a long time, right? Amazon, Facebook, Google, they're all in our lives because they're venture-backed companies, and they're important and useful, and they've taught us behaviors that we now use for a lot of different things, right? We'll stay in someone's home without knowing them. We have to search for everything on Google. I want my product delivered to my house within 24 hours. Like, these are behaviors that venture-backed companies have taught us, and they were funded 10 years ago. So if we're in a moment now that women's health is now has the importance and the scale and the demand that it has, when venture gets behind it, it has high influence on what ends up in our lives 6, 7, 10 years from now. And so we have a really big role to play in pushing this category forward because of the level of funding and the level of growth these companies represent in terms of where they land in public markets and the hiring they do and the level of R&D that they facilitate. I think we have to take very seriously the role that venture plays in really scaling this category.
Definitely. Yeah, that's interesting to think about the different players and the roles they can each play. Yeah, and so while we're on the topic of venture-backed companies, I wanted to jump over to talk a little bit more about the exit environment. That was one of the other data points that really stuck out to me from the report. of just understanding what's happening with exits, who's waiting to exit, what's happening in the meantime. It doesn't seem like it's a great time across the board, women's health irrespective, but Raysa, I'd love to hear from you. I think you got into this a little bit during your presentation, but how are you expecting this kind of exit environment to influence what comes next in 2024?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I just want to back up and say that this is impacting all of the innovation economy, not just women's health. Like, I know that slide was obviously devoted to women's health companies, but we've really seen it across all venture-backed publics and publics in general. It's just this pretty poor performance that seemed to actually be improving at like the mid-year mark this year, but a lot of companies that are public or recently public are really still trading at like bargain prices. I think in my conversations with a lot of investors, they are expecting the exit, specifically IPO market, to remain really, really muted until late next year. I will say there was some optimism around the mid-year and there was a trickle of IPOs, but it did seem like those IPOs were really reserved for top tier companies that for the life sciences were pretty late along in their development stage. So less like companies IPOing with preclinical assets, more at the later stage. So like safer bets. So I would expect the same to be seen in women's health. But on the M&A front, like I did say, we did see a lot more activity there. And I know Naseem touched on it earlier. But I think consolidation is a really natural next step for a lot of the companies in this environment. And again, as we see more companies become more later and later stage, like because there's been an influx of early stage, especially 2020, 2021. Those companies are now starting to get at a point where they can raise, an additional round, or they could potentially be acquired, or potentially if things don't go right, shutter their doors, unfortunately. So I would expect to see more consolidation through the end of this year. I know it's almost over, and next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And Raysa, just because you might have seen this data, a question that came through was, has there been an impact on valuations? I think we're seeing that in the form of down rounds and things like that across the board. Was that something that showed up in your data, valuation hits to women's health companies specifically?
Yes, certainly. I think one thing that's interesting is for seed stage valuations, they've increased every year except for this year when they went down slightly, but it kind of matched the same downturn that you saw in overall healthcare. So I wouldn't say they were like disproportionately impacted, but you definitely are seeing that impact trickle down on those companies. I will say also like I said earlier, there's a larger proportion of companies that are early stage in the women's health space because it is a newer or younger sector. So the kind of good news is that you don't have as many companies as in overall healthcare and tech that were mid to late stage in 2021 when there was like this huge boom and valuations were overinflated. So, and now they're going to raise a round and they're met with their like staggering valuation that they were tagged with in that funding year when that's the way things were. And so they have to take a flat round or a down round. So because you have more early stage companies that are raising for the first time, like seed, it's their first valuation, they are getting priced in this new environment that is really more focused on fundamentals. So, you have less of those down rounds. I will say though, one thing to keep in mind is valuations are increasingly underreported because for private rounds, there's no requirements to report them. So we have seen the share of undisclosed valuations on private rounds really, I think it increased like twofold. So I suspect there's a lot more down and flat rounds that are happening that are just not reported on.
Yeah, I bet. Summer, how are you kind of grappling with this current exit environment? You don't have to be, but if you are.
Yeah, I would love to be grappling with exits right now. That's not something I'm having to grapple with right at the moment, but in the future I will. So I think that both Raysa and Naseem hit it right on the head. You had kind of this explosion of innovation. And then you saw a lot of people trying to attack the same problem, maybe in different veins. And there is enough blue ocean opportunity that there's room for a lot of point solutions in women's health. But now, as the market is maturing, and I think that this market seems to be maturing at a faster rate than other markets, almost because it's like it's catching up. So we're kind of on this steep curve. But as it matures, I do think that founders like myself are seeing the benefit to aligning with others in our particular vein that we're working in, where there are synergies and improving our ability to get a valuation that we think is, in alignment with the value that we'll bring to the market, but also to reduce the competition, because right now I think it's really easy to confuse investors in women's health. We hear that, well, we just don't know who's going to be the winner, and we haven't invested in this part, so often. And it's like, well, you never know who the winner is going to be. I mean, we can go through your graveyard of portfolio companies if you're on your 10th fund and see how many times it didn't work out. So, I think that the founders in this space have a really, really unique position, and that they are quite possibly one of the most collaborative group of founders I've ever seen. So I think that a lot of the consolidation that you see are probably less hostile than you would see in other spaces, and more about two founders saying, hey, you've got A, I've got B, together we have got this whole vein sewed up, let's do this. And I, have to say I'm excited about that, because I think you're going to see some really strong solutions come out of that.
Yeah, that sounds nice and collaborative. I think we could probably keep this kind of conversation going for way longer than we're supposed to, but just being mindful of time, I wanted to jump ahead to a few of kind of the questions that came in, a little bit unrelated to the report, but ones that us folks on the panel have been thinking about as well. And that's like the role of data and AI in women's health. Just looking at conversations, there's been some questions about the data collection and about, who might be the best place, like a Flatiron Health of women's health to kind of help guide this data. So I kind of wanted to pose the question to you three of just understanding, what is that current state of play with data, and how is that starting to shift, especially as the conversation of AI comes into it? I'll let any of you three jump in. A little chaotic there.
I'll start, and then I know Summer has an opinion on this, because we've talked about it quite a bit. And I started to say this earlier, but AI is going to be really, really powerful when it comes to women's health. There's going to be an ability to get really thoughtful, really predictive, and get much more proactive around women's health than we've ever been able to be before. The big hurdle is we don't have the data right now. And so, the gaps in data when it comes to what's out in the healthcare system right now, when it comes to even the number of trials that are focused on women's health today, it's like sub 2% of all the clinical trials that happen. A bulk of that is focused on fertility. So we're in a place where those things have to shift before we're going to be able to reasonably put AI on top of women's health data. The other component of that is that even if the number of data sets and the clinical trials, et cetera, increase, they have to be representative. They have to be diverse. They have to cover every kind of woman out in the world, not just one monolithic profile. And that's going to take some deliberateness from the ecosystem. And that's why even women's health doesn't get enough funding generally. If you start to do the intersections across the profile of the founders and who they're building for, what they're building for, all of these companies need funding. They should all be thinking about data on their roadmaps. They should all be thinking about AI on those roadmaps, because if we still only cover certain profiles of women, even when that data exists, we're still going to be underserving a significant portion of the population, and we won't be in any better shape than we were. The good news is that most of the founders in the ecosystem are aware of this, and it comes up in conversation a lot, and there's a lot of very collaborative thoughtfulness that's happening around this. So to Summer's point, the number of conversations I have with groups of founders who are thinking about how they're going to connect their data sets together, how they can think about AI as a collective, how they can make investments that are parallel so that they're not no one wants someone to run ahead on the AI front necessarily, because that data model has to learn. It has to be an LLM that can actually scale. And so there's a lot of conversation happening on that front. And I think I know 1, 2, maybe 3 founders that are building the tech infrastructure that the women's health companies are going to need in order to start to test and learn with AI. And we need to see that happen more. And then those relationships to get built so that we can literally connect the dots on what's happening with the data we're building, and the way that we can start to make it more thoughtful and predictive.
I could not agree more with everything that you just said. As you know, my master's in data analytics, so this is an area near and dear to my heart. But it's so apparent to me in women's health that the mantra of garbage in, garbage out is, I mean, it is cautionary. There are red flags everywhere. So as you see some of these companies building, AI models and predictive models as it relates to chronic health conditions and diseases, I think it's really important, to your point, that we have representatives from each demographic that should be represented in there. And unfortunately, that's going to take a lot more time than anyone here wants to admit, because we have serious trust obstacles to compensate for in those communities, and building those bridges of trust and making sure that people understand that their data is going to be used responsibly and understand how that's going to impact them and their privacy and all of those things are all really important. I got the 1 minute wave, so I'm going to stop it there. But yes, we need to be very thoughtful about how we're layering that into the solutions we're offering.
Absolutely. No, I think I could see, Raysa, maybe the next report is focused on data and AI and women's health. But yeah, thank you guys all so much for joining this conversation. It's been fascinating to see kind of the questions that folks have about the industry. Lots of questions coming in about the endometriosis market, Summer, so got a lot of interest there. But yeah, so sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but I hope this was a fascinating discussion. Hope you're able to check out the report, and thanks again so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.